They have long been recognized as the backbone of the United States Army.
Ladies and gentlemen, the creed of the non-commissioned officer.
No one is more professional than I.
The corporals, the sergeants,
I am a member of a time-honored corps.
the proud warriors who so adeptly perform as small unit leaders, trainers, and guardians of standards.
Competence is my watchword.
They are respected for their professionalism,
I will strive to remain tactically and technically proficient.
for their commitment to knowledge,
I know my soldiers and I will always place their needs above my own.
and for their enduring capacity for selfless service.
I will not forget.
Nor will I allow my comrades to forget.
That we are professionals. Non-commissioned officers.
Leaders.
Congratulations on your acceptance and commitment to the Non-Commissioned Officer Corps. Take this manual as a guide to train and challenge our soldiers.
Non-commissioned officers in the U.S. Army share the pride of a rich history of accomplishment. NCOs were crucial in transforming General George Washington's Continental Army into a battle-worthy arm, capable of going up against British regulars on the battlefield. On the western frontier, NCOs accepted responsibility for leading scouting parties to locate enemy forces. During the Civil War, they embraced the deadly task of carrying the colors so commanders could locate and maneuver their units. When the flag moved, the lines moved as well. In World War I, squad leaders began supervising fire teams instead of just individual soldiers, reflecting their ability to adapt to the changing technologies and circumstances of warfare. During World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, young NCOs continued to refine their effectiveness as small unit leaders. Through revolution, civil war, world wars, regional wars, and operations for the protection of national interests, NCOs have carried forward the best traditions of their corps. While officers command units, NCOs lead soldiers, train them, inspire excellence, and stand strong as paragons of professionalism. The leaders of the American Revolution drew on the military traditions of Europe as they created an army. But in the fighting that ensued, the army evolved, and the role of the American NCO became unique. It was during this time that NCOs first assumed the role they continue today as guardians of standards. In 1779, former Prussian General Friedrich von Steuben, Washington's appointee as Inspector General of the Army, wrote the first regulations for duties and responsibilities for non-commissioned officers. These regulations, commonly called the Blue Book, spell out the duties and responsibilities of NCOs and became the official military manual for the next 30 years. The Blue Book required the Sergeant Major to be well acquainted with the internal management and discipline of the regiment. It charged the first sergeant with discipline of the company, good conduct of the men, their exactness in obeying orders, and regularity of their manners. Today, the maintenance of these standards are as relevant as they were over 2 centuries ago. During the Revolution, the new Army developed a system for the identification of NCOs through the use of different colored epaulets to distinguish rank, duties, and branches. From the beginning, NCOs have served bravely and with distinction in America's armies. 3 sergeants in the Continental Army received the newly created Badge of Military Merit for acts of heroism. Today, we call this award the Purple Heart. One of the sergeants was William Brown. It is believed that Sergeant Brown led the advance party against Redoubt No. 10 at Yorktown. Instead of waiting for the approach to be cleared, he masterminded a surprise assault. Using only their bayonets, the Americans ignored musket fire and grenades, leapt over barriers, and captured the position within 10 minutes. His action led to the surrender of the British 4 days later. Sergeant Elijah Churchill and Sergeant Daniel Bissell received the badge for similar acts of heroism. NCOs also played a significant role in America's westward expansion. The Army launched several expeditions to explore the lands of the Louisiana Purchase between 1803 and 1812. And all of these expeditions included enlisted men and NCOs. One of them, Sergeant Patrick Gass, was a veteran soldier. He began his military career when he volunteered to take his father's place in the Virginia militia fighting against the Indians. He made sergeant in General Alexander Hamilton's 19th Regiment during the Revolution. After a break in service, he joined Captain Meriwether Lewis for the Northwest Expedition and regained his stripes when he replaced a sergeant who died. Sergeant Gass succeeded in leading his men across the continent and back with no further loss of life. He published a journal of the expedition, which today provides us with detailed knowledge of that journey. Gass remained in the Army and fought with distinction in the War of 1812 before he retired. The evolution of NCOs continued through the 1800s. In 1812, red sashes and swords were added to the uniform for sergeants and above to distinguish their positions as non-commissioned officers. A few years later, in 1821, the Army changed the rank identification system again. NCOs were identified by chevrons rather than epaulets and sashes. Some units wore the point up and some down. By 1851, however, all units wore the chevrons with the point down and would do so for more than 50 years. The first school for instruction of enlisted men opened at Fort Monroe in 1824. Though suspended from time to time, it served as the precursor for modern technical training. The Abstract of Infantry Tactics, published in 1829, provided instructions specifically for training NCOs. The purpose of this instruction centered on ensuring all NCOs possessed an accurate knowledge of the exercise and use of their firelocks, of the manual exercise of the soldier, and of the firings and marching. The Army's personnel requirements continued to expand. Garrison troops were needed to maintain peace among different Indian tribes. The opening of the Santa Fe Trail in the 1820s created a need for mounted soldiers. They were considered elite troops and were required to be native-born American citizens. Immigration dramatically changed the Army from 1840 onward. Irish and German immigrants composed large numbers of many units. Ulysses S. Grant estimated that over half the Army during this period consisted of men born in foreign countries. In 1840, NCOs adopted the distinctive sword they still use today. It has always been more of a symbol of rank than a weapon of war because it is ill-balanced. Nearly two-thirds of troops in the Mexican War from 1846 to 1848 were volunteers. NCOs had the difficult task of leading these brave citizen soldiers to Mexico City and victory. During the Civil War, the use of more open battle formations enhanced the combat leadership role of NCOs. They led the lines of skirmishers that preceded each unit, and they also carried the flags and regimental colors of their units. Corporal Peter Welch, a member of the 28th Massachusetts, carried the colors for his Irish Brigade. During the Civil War, racial and ethnic groups often made up entire Army units. After the Civil War, non-commissioned officers helped rebuild the nation by establishing outposts of protection for settlers moving west. During the Indian Wars, troops often fought in small detachments. With few officers available, they relied heavily on the knowledge and abilities of their NCOs. The Army discontinued most ethnic units after the Civil War, but African-American Buffalo soldiers of the 24th and 25th Infantry and 9th and 10th Cavalry went on to make significant contributions in the years to come. One Buffalo soldier, Sergeant George Jordan, Troop K, 9th Cavalry, received the Medal of Honor for actions during the campaign against the Apache leader Victorio in 1880. Sergeant Jordan led a 25-man detachment to Tularosa, New Mexico to meet a coming attack. Standing firm against more than 100 Apaches, he and his men prevented the town's destruction. Training of NCOs continued to evolve in the second half of the 1800s. In 1869, the Signal Corps established a school for training officers and NCOs at Fort Whipple, now known as Fort Myer. This school, along with the reopening of the artillery school at Fort Monroe in 1870, helped Signal Corps and artillery soldiers gain the advanced technical knowledge needed to operate complex equipment and instruments. The early 1900s brought several changes for NCOs. In 1902, the Army decided that chevrons should be worn with the points up, and they are still worn that way today. A few years later, in 1909, the Non-Commissioned Officers Manual more clearly defined the duties of the NCO than previous publications. The growth of warfighting technology in the 20th century continued to influence the NCO Corps. The demand for specialists grew with the development of increasingly sophisticated armor, aviation, motorized transport, and chemical warfare. The Army was forced to compete with industry for technical workers and compensated NCOs accordingly. World War I required the first massive training the U.S. had seen, and NCOs trained 4 million soldiers. During the late 1930s, the Army separated specialists and technicians from the NCO Corps and designated their rank with a special T chevron. This left the NCO Corps comprised of only soldiers who were leaders of men. As time went on, the Army had to decide whether high-ranked specialists really were NCOs. The answer has sometimes been yes and sometimes been no. Right now, the answer is yes, and only one rank of specialists exists in the Army. In World War II, mobilization created a staggering growth in the number of NCOs and also their percentage in the Army. From the Continental Army of the 1780s, when NCOs